Hello and welcome to earlymusicsources.com. My name is Elam Rotem and today we'll talk about Gregorian chant. Commonly, Gregorian chant, or more correctly, plain chant, is considered to be a small chapter in the beginning of the history of Western music, the first step before real music came into being. That chapter, however, never really ended. Plain chant is a repertory that has continued to exist throughout the centuries, into the present day. In this episode, we'll present some highlights from the story of the Gregorian chant, from the 9th century to the 20th century. Let's start. Singing has been part of the Christian liturgy since the earliest days of the Church. We just don't know much about it, because there was no way to preserve the music. We only know that its repertoire was not unified. Each place had its own musical traditions. We know this because at a later stage, around the 8th century, there was an attempt to unify the chants throughout the Christian world, so that all the churches would follow a single canon and would sing the same repertoire. This was done by means of the presentation of the famous myth. The Holy Spirit in the form of a dove sang the chants to Pope Gregory, who then wrote them down or dictated them to someone. By the way, this is why literally only a rather specific portion of the monophonic church chants should be actually called Gregorian. Anything else should be called more generically plain chant. But wait, what exactly did Pope Gregory or his clerk write down or notate? They lived in the 6th century, while the first forms of musical notation were introduced only some centuries later. So even if one sets aside the supernatural aspect of the myth, it has a timeline problem due to the not yet invented way of transmitting music. How can one transmit music without a way of notating it? The only way is by personal guidance and a very good memory, both on the part of the teachers and of the students. However, if you want to transmit a huge repertoire to hundreds of institutions scattered over a vast geographical area, this is simply not good enough. Let's see how they dealt with this problem in the 10th century, establishing one of the earliest forms of musical notation. In this important manuscript from the St. Gallen Monastery in Switzerland, we see that in addition to the text, there are signs called neumes. These neumes carry musical meaning. First of all, they indicate the number of notes that should be sung to each text syllable. Then, the neumes convey musical gestures, going up, going up and then going down, etc. Some signs are clarified in the manuscript itself, but the full explanation of the neumes is understood only retrospectively by using later sources that include more accurate notation systems. Here we see the Christmas introit Puer natus est nobis, and it is evident that this notation lacks precise information about the pitches and the exact relations between them. Without this information, a person who does not know the music cannot learn it from this notation alone. Therefore, it has been concluded that this notation was meant for people who already knew the melodies, and the notation was there mainly as a reminder to them. Also, it is quite clear that this manuscript was not used for performance. It was used as a studying and memorizing tool. From a modern perspective, this might seem like a not so good annotation system, as it doesn't really allow the communication of notes as we are used to today. However, coming from a world where everything was based on memory, this is an ingenious tool to memorize and teach the chants. And in fact, it includes refined musical instructions that will be missed in later sources, for example, in the much debated field of rhythm. In any case, more precise notation systems were sought after. Let's see. It's not that there were no ways whatsoever to communicate music more accurately. Starting in the 9th century, we find theoretical writings that include interesting ways to do so. But these ways of notation were not used in the chant books that were used for the liturgy. The system of neumes we saw in the St. Gallen manuscripts was improved slightly in some cases, such as in this manuscript. Here again we have puer natus est nobis. The vertical relationship in the position of the different neumes suggests the musical relation between them, which note is higher and which is lower. But since there is no reference point, we still don't know what notes they are exactly. The person who solved this problem for everybody is the famous Guido d'Arezzo. He added indications to where F and C are. F and C are important because they indicate where the semitone lies. The reader now knows that the steps are generally whole tones, except when they are below F and C, where the steps are semitones. Now we can actually know which pitches have been notated, and people who never knew the music can now use the manuscript and learn it without external guidance. In other words, it is now possible to sight-read music. Now that it's more feasible, let's try to read the beginning of this version of Puer natus est. Puer natus est nobis. Sometime later, in the 13th century, in a manuscript contemporary to the famous Notre Dame school, where we find the early forms of polyphony, we see something quite different. Here again we have puer natus est nobis. As you see, the scribes don't notate the neumes as thin dots and lines anymore, but with more substantial squares, with the multinote neumes looking more like ligatures. Versions of this notation will continue to be used for centuries to come, and will be even readopted in the late 19th century. But more about that later. Until polyphony was introduced, the main thing to fall under the term music were just melodies, monophony. These were rather free rhythmically, or at least not rigidly bound to any system. But once different melodies were meant to be performed in synchronization, that is, polyphony, precise rhythm became increasingly important. It was at this point that both the theory and practice of mensural notation were starting to develop. As a consequence, from that time on, there were two kinds of music. The rather rhythmically free cantus planus, or plain chant, and the more rigid cantus mensurabilis, polyphony, that was based on counterpoint and mensural theories. Despite their distinction in style, function, and notation, the two have been living side by side in peace since then until today. Anyway, let's now leave the Middle Ages, skip many interesting things that we cannot cover on this occasion, and see what happened to plain chant in the 16th century. It is well known that the Council of Trent and the Counter-Reformation had a great impact on music in the second half of the 16th century. The main complaint of the council was that the sung texts were not clear enough. And this did not only concern complex polyphonic music, it was in regards to monophonic chants. Therefore, the council demanded the reformation of chants in such a way that the text would be more comprehensible. This, for example, could be done by cutting out long melismas, making sure that the text underlay supported the accents of the words, singing not too slow, and in other ways. The task to purge, correct, and reform Gregorian chant was given by Pope Gregory XIII, how symbolic Gregory, to no other than the famous Giovanni Pierluigi da Palestrina, one of the most respected musicians of the time. In the end, though, Palestrina didn't do it. One of his students did, and from 1582 on, new Reformed Catholic chant books were published. These books continued to be reprinted until the middle of the 18th century. Very interestingly, these chant books included note values. It wasn't as strict as in the mensural notation, but it allowed for a better notation of the accents of the words. For example here, where it says domine, the first accented syllable gets the longest value, and the second and least important syllable gets the shortest value. Domine labia mea aperies. Another important revolution that happened to plainchant started in France in the middle of the 17th century. The Neo-Gallican movement separated itself from the Pope in several ways, one of which was in their plainchant. The Neo-Gallican chants include a rather surprising repertoire. Some chants were newly composed in old Gregorian style, a very interesting case of historical period composition. Other chants were composed in a more modern way, using a more refined method of notation, which included tremolo, vibrato, portamento, ornaments, and detailed tempo instructions. In addition, there was a practice of improvising additional voices based on the chants, chant sur le livre, that included accompanying the chants with bass instruments such as the serpent, if you just happen to be wondering what this instrument was used for anyway. The Neo-Gallican chant was used until the middle of the 19th century, and although it is a rather big, self-contained corpus of music with its own historical and liturgical context, it was dismissed and ridiculed by many in the late 19th century, and thus it has been practically forgotten. Now, if you want to have a real revolution in Gregorian chant, you should have a monk or two who are also musicologists. This was exactly the case in the French abbey of Solesmes in the middle of the 19th century. Let's see. The Benedictine monks of Solesmes believed that the contemporary and accepted editions of the Gregorian chants, that is, those of the 19th century, represent a corrupted version of the originals. They believed that Pope Gregory the Great, with the help of the dove of course, wrote the original chants, and it was their duty to research and reconstruct the originals the best they could. So, instead of relying on 16th and 17th century sources like other contemporary editions, they went to earlier sources and recovered old manuscripts from all over Europe. Thanks to the new technology of photography, and in order to make a point, starting in 1889, they published numerous volumes of facsimile editions of old chant manuscripts. Their persistence paid off, and in November 1903, Pope Pius X approved their approach towards the chants, that were, in his words, so happily restored to their integrity and purity. The Pope then commissioned them to print a new and complete version of the reconstructed chants. It was at this point that the debates concerning the interpretation of the sources came to a climax, especially in the field of the rhythm of the chants, but also otherwise. For how can one distill one correct version from such a huge amount of source material that represents different traditions, spanning hundreds of years and vast geographical areas? Not to mention that as opposed to purely theoretical debates that have little concern with practice, here we are talking about the way people would actually sing the prayers for years to come, at least until the next revolution. Thus, by being so very connected with practice, the editions of Solesmes made great musicological compromises. They developed a hybrid notation system based on 13th and 14th century manuscripts that communicated only the things that they thought to be important, and according to the way they believed the chants should be performed. In fact, the way we know Gregorian chant in the 20th century, both in its notation and performance practice, is in most cases the way Solesmes left it for us. Now you see that it's practically impossible to say anything about Gregorian chant as a whole. Every generation and every place had its own Gregorian chant, its own notation standards, its own performance practices, and so on. However, since this is such a big subject and there are so many little interesting things, before finishing up, we'll mention 9 random yet interesting points about Gregorian chant. 1. Gender. Gregorian chant is often associated with singing of male monks, but in monasteries of nuns, chants were performed in the same manner, only an octave higher, of course. 2. Modes. The 8 church modes were mentioned and connected with the plain chants from the very beginning. The chants were categorized according to the modes, which were used as a tool to remember, define, and combine chants. The theory of the original church modes didn't change much for hundreds of years, despite the parallel development of new mode theories along the centuries. 3. Additional repertoire. In most traditions, the original Gregorian chants were considered perfect, and changes or revisions were not allowed. In order to express new ideas, new forms of chant were developed, such as tropes, sequences, and liturgical dramas. 4. Liturgical dramas. An especially interesting chant genre from the Middle Ages, where liturgical and paraliturgical texts were set to music, and different characters were sung by different performers. Medieval opera, if you want. In our days, the most famous and repeatedly performed piece is the early 13th century Ludus Danielis, the play of Daniel. 5. Instruments. Although occasionally prohibited throughout the history of chant, there are cases where instrumental accompaniments took place, especially on the organ, but not only. 6. Alternatim. Often, instead of having all the bits of the chant sung, the music was divided between vocal performance and instrumental performance. The instrumental parts were compositions based on the chant. Famous and beautiful examples for that are found in Frescobaldi's Fiori Musicali. 7. Basis for composition. Throughout the centuries, plain chant melodies were used as a basis for polyphonic compositions. Here are some random and famous examples. Josquin de Prez's Missa Pangelingua, Claudio Monteverdi's Vespers, Johann Sebastian Bach's Credo from the B minor Mass, and Hector Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique. 8. Basis for improvisation. We briefly mentioned the Neo-Gallican practice of singing the chant and improvising further voices above it on the spot, chant sur le livre. However, evidence for such practices, cantare super librum in Latin, is found throughout Europe between the 15th and 17th centuries. It was a simple way to add a bit of harmony to the chants without composing anything. The Italian term associated with this practice is contrappunto alla mente, that is, counterpoint out of one's head. 9. Interpretation. Apart from late practices recorded in the early 20th century, we know extremely little about the way in which chants were sung. Not only are the basic elements of performance unknown to us, from ornamentation and tempo to vocal timbre and phrasing, but even the pronunciation and rhythm are still obscure to us. This episode was perhaps long, but not as long as the unbroken line of the Gregorian chant, from the Middle Ages and until today. Many thanks to Kelly Landerkin for sharing her vast knowledge with us. Don't forget to check the special page on our website with all the footnotes and other extra information. Feel free to comment, share, like, and see you next time at earlymusicsources.com.